Evan Cole regained consciousness with the taste of salt burning his tongue. His eyelids felt heavy, crusted with sand, and every muscle in his body ached as if the ocean had chewed him up and spit him out. When he finally forced his eyes open, he found himself lying on a narrow strip of pale shoreline, the waves gently rolling up to his legs like they were checking if he was still alive. The sky above him was clear, strangely clear. No clouds, no wind, no trace of the violent storm he remembered. The last thing he recalled was gripping the wheel of his research boat as a monstrous wall of water swallowed the vessel whole. He sat up slowly, coughing hard, trying to steady his breathing. "Where am I?" he whispered to no one. He scanned the horizon. There was no wreckage, no broken equipment, no sign that his boat had ever existed. Just endless water on one side and a dense wall of green on the other, towering trees, thick vines, and vegetation so vibrant it almost looked artificial. But the most disturbing thing was the silence. There were no birds, no insects, no rustling leaves. Just a thick, suffocating stillness that wrapped around him like cold hands. Evan pushed himself to his feet and stumbled toward the tree line. With every step, the silence grew heavier. It felt as if the entire island were holding its breath, watching him, waiting for him to come closer. The trees were enormous, their trunks twisted and gnarled. The canopy so dense, it let almost no sunlight through. Evan hesitated before entering the shade, feeling a faint instinctive warning deep in his gut. But he had no choice. Staying on the beach meant starvation. Staying put meant death. He stepped into the forest. The temperature dropped immediately. The air felt thick and humid, clinging to his skin. He kept walking, brushing aside leaves the size of dinner plates. His heart hammered harder with every step, not from exertion but from the sense that something was wrong here. Deeply wrong. 20 minutes passed before the first strange thing happened. Evan stopped to catch his breath, leaning against a tree. "Hello," he called out, more out of desperation than belief. His voice echoed back to him. But the echo wasn't right. It repeated too fast, too cleanly, like someone standing just behind him had said the word at the same time. "Hello?" the echo replied softly. Evan froze. He turned, scanning the trees. Nothing. Just thick shadows and that crushing silence. He swallowed hard and moved on. Another 10 minutes passed before he found the structure. At first, he thought it was a rock formation covered in vines, but as he got closer, he saw metal beneath the greenery, rusted, corroded, and out of place in a place like this. A faded sign hung crookedly over a half-collapsed door. Evan brushed dirt off it with shaking fingers. Project Calypso, Research Sector 3. He stepped back, pulse quickening. "Research?" he whispered. What were they doing out here? A faint clank echoed from inside the building. Evan's breath caught. Another clank, then another. Slow, rhythmic, like footsteps. He backed away, but the door creaked open on its own, revealing only darkness. A cold draft slid across his skin, though the air outside was warm. Then, from deep within the shadows, he heard it. A slow, steady exhale. Not his own. Something inside the abandoned facility was breathing, and it knew he was there. Evan stepped through the warped doorway of the abandoned structure as cautiously as if he were entering the ribcage of some dead creature. Inside, the temperature felt wrong, colder than the air outside, yet heavy and humid at the same time, like a thick breath pressing against his skin. The dim light that filtered through the ceiling, cracks revealed a scene frozen in decay. Rusted consoles lined the walls, their screens shattered into spider webs of glass. Papers were scattered across the floor, stained by years of moisture. Some were torn, others warped, but all of them seemed as if someone had desperately tried to destroy evidence before fleeing. The metal smell in the air mixed with something bitter, something chemical. Evan swept his flashlight slowly from side to side. The beam flickered, struggling to stay alive, as if the building itself was sucking energy out of it. The silence inside was even worse than the forest, thick, unnatural, like the building was holding its breath. He knelt beside a pile of soaked documents. Most words were unreadable. The ink bled into blue and black stains. But one sheet, pinned under a bent clipboard, remained strangely intact, as if deliberately preserved. Evan lifted it with trembling fingers. Subjective temporal distortion. Identified. Island behavior appears sentient. His spine tingled. Sentient? What could that mean? A geological phenomenon couldn't be sentient. An ecosystem couldn't think. Yet the forest outside had already behaved as if it did. He flipped the page over, hoping for more context. The back was blank. Another faint sound echoed deeper inside the structure. A soft, metallic bang. Then another. Slow, deliberate, like someone moving something heavy across the floor. Evan's breath caught. He scanned the corridor ahead, a long tunnel of darkness, swallowed entirely by shadows. No light reached the end. His flashlight beam wavered at the edge of the darkness, like it was afraid to go any farther. "Is someone there?" Evan called out. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, from the darkness, came a whisper. A whisper of his name, not windy, not muffled, not distorted, perfectly clear. Evan. Evan's knees weakened. His skin crawled with the primal fear that he wasn't alone, and whatever was with him knew him. Something about the voice was wrong, not because it was threatening, but because it sounded familiar. Too familiar. It sounded like him. He stumbled backward, gripping the flashlight so tightly his knuckles ached. The humming sound began, low at first, barely noticeable, a faint vibration rising from beneath the floor. Then it grew louder, pulsing, rhythmic, almost biological. The ground quivered as if a massive machine, or a living thing, stirred beneath the foundation. The entire structure seemed to inhale. Evan's flashlight flickered, once, twice, and died, plunging him into absolute blackness. For several agonizing seconds, Evan stood frozen, the darkness pressing in around him, swallowing the room whole. The humming beneath his feet grew louder, vibrating up through his legs, rattling his ribs. He reached out blindly and felt cold metal under his fingertips. Then something shifted in the hallway. Not a sound, a presence, a sense of movement. As if someone, or something, was slowly stepping toward him in the dark. Evan didn't wait to find out. He turned and sprinted out of the building, stumbling through the doorway and back into the forest's dim light. He gasped for air as if he'd been underwater. The moment he stepped outside, the humming stopped, leaving behind a ringing stillness. But something was different now. The forest around him felt closer. The trees angled in subtly, like they were leaning toward him. Shadows that hadn't been there before stretched long across the ground, pointing directly at him. The air had changed too, warmer, more suffocating, like the island itself was aware of him stepping back into its domain. Evan looked back at the building, his heartbeat pounding in his ears. A flicker of movement caught his eye. In one of the broken windows, a shadow passed across the glass, smooth, humanoid, unmistakably a silhouette of a person. But the building had been empty. There was no sign of life inside. No animals, no people, only him. The shadow paused, as if it knew he was watching. Evan's breath hitched. When the shadow vanished, it didn't fade. It snapped out of existence, like a glitch. He backed away slowly, refusing to look away from the window. afraid that turning his back would invite something to crawl out after him. A breeze moved through the forest, the first he had felt since arriving. But the leaves didn't rustle naturally. They shuddered, jerky, uneven, as if something was brushing past them. Evan tightened his backpack straps. He wasn't alone on this island, and whatever else was here had already found him. Evan forced himself to keep moving, putting distance between himself and the abandoned structure until the trees swallowed it completely. His heartbeat was uneven, sharp, and anxious, as if his body understood more about the danger than his mind could. He checked behind him repeatedly, each glance making him feel as though the forest had shifted a little closer. The narrow trail ahead wound through thick vegetation. Vines crawled over the ground like veins, and the canopy above was so dense that sunlight reached him only in broken, shimmering patches. Every flicker of light seemed to bend strangely, as if something unseen was moving between the beams. But whenever he looked directly, there was nothing. The forest grew more unnatural the farther he walked. The trees weren't merely tall, they were distorted, their trunks curving and twisting like they'd grown under some invisible pressure. Some bent over the trail, forming incomplete archways. Others spiraled upward, their bark carved with grooves that resembled symbols. At one point, Evan found a tree with a perfectly shaped hollow, smooth, curved, exactly the size of a human torso. It was too precise to be natural. He stepped away quickly. The air here was heavier, warmer, humid enough to cling to his skin. The smell of soil mixed with a faint metallic scent that made him swallow hard. He wiped sweat from his forehead, but the moisture stayed. It felt like the forest breathed around him. The deeper he went, the more he noticed the silence. No birds, no insects, no rustling of animals. The only sounds were his own, each footstep, each breath, each crack of a twig echoing too loudly in the stillness. It didn't feel like a quiet forest. It felt like a place holding its breath, listening. Then he heard something faint. Tap, tap, tap. Slow, distant, rhythmic. Not wind, not branches. A deliberate knocking sound carrying through the trees in a way that made the hairs on his arms stand up. When he stopped walking, the tapping stopped too, immediately, as if it sensed him listening. "Hello?" he called, then instantly regretted it. His voice felt wrong here, swallowed by the forest with no echo, no answer. He walked faster, wanting to outrun whatever presence he felt pressing in around him. The path dipped downward, then curved sharply, and suddenly the forest opened into a clearing. The shift was so abrupt he froze. The clearing was nearly a perfect circle. The trees around it stood evenly spaced, their trunks straight, their branches arching inward like they formed a barrier. The ground inside was strangely smooth, no plants, no rocks, no fallen branches. Just flat earth, dark and undisturbed. In the center stood a wooden post, about 6 feet tall. Evan approached slowly. The post was old, weathered, but carved with deep spiraling lines and sharp symbols. They looked like language, foreign, looping, intentionally arranged. Some grooves held a dark residue, dried into the wood. He didn't want to imagine what it had been. He circled the post, feeling the air shift around him. The clearing felt different from the forest, denser, muted, as though sound could not fully form here. Even the sunlight seemed dimmer within the circular space. He reached toward the carvings, wanting a closer look. The moment his fingertips brushed the wood, the ground gave a soft tremor. A gentle vibration, not enough to knock him off balance, but enough to confirm he hadn't imagined it. The trees along the edge rustled for the first time since he'd arrived, their leaves shivering like something had passed through them. A low hum began to rise, deep, resonant, vibrating through his ribs. It felt ancient. Evan yanked his hand away. The hum stopped instantly. He stared at the post, breath held. The carved lines seemed to move slightly, catching light in a way that made them appear to pulse. His instincts screamed at him to leave. Everything about the clearing felt wrong, purposeful, waiting. He stepped backward carefully. From behind him, in the trees, tap, tap, tap. Closer this time. Much closer. Evan spun around, scanning the tree line. Nothing moved, nothing shifted. But the forest no longer felt empty. The silence wasn't neutral anymore. It was charged, alert, like something stood just beyond the edge of sight, watching him through the trees, waiting for his next step. The forest grew denser, every tree crowding closer together, as if trying to block him from moving forward. Branches scratched at his arms and face, leaves clinging like wet cloth. The undergrowth thickened, roots twisting across the path, until suddenly the trees thinned abruptly. Evan stumbled into a wide circular depression in the earth, a crater unlike anything he had ever seen. The ground sloped downward gently, forming a shallow basin, and at its center stood a monolith that made his stomach twist into knots. It wasn't just a rock. The structure shimmered faintly, stone-like yet unnatural, as though its surface was slightly liquid, reflecting the pale light in ways the forest did not. Deep grooves etched across its surface formed symbols that seemed to pulse gently, glowing from within, radiating a subtle warmth he could feel against his skin, even though the air remained cool. His pulse quickened. Evan stepped closer, his legs shaking. The moment he did, the air itself seemed to warp. Colors shifted subtly, the edges of the crater bending in a way that made his eyes strain. Sounds became distorted, the distant hum of the forest echoing like it was underwater. The ground beneath him rippled as though mirages of heat danced across it, though the temperature was far from hot. He felt nauseous, dizzy, as if the island was pressing in on him from every direction. At the base of the monolith, a metal console jutted from the earth. Its casing was dented, panels missing, wires dangling like exposed veins. Evan approached slowly, holding his breath, his hand trembling as he brushed dirt and moss away. The console's screen flickered weakly, displaying fragmented text. Resonance beacon prototype. Island neural dampening. The words made his stomach drop. The monolith wasn't a natural formation. It was a device. Something the previous researchers had built, connected to the very core of the island's power. Whoever had designed this had attempted to control it, to contain it, or perhaps to escape it. Evan knelt beside the console and examined the wires. Most had been torn or chewed through, like the island itself had resisted their interference. A handwritten note, yellowed and water-stained, was pinned under one of the loose panels. He unfolded it carefully. Beacon temporarily weakens the island's awareness. Use only if escape is imminent. Escape. The word echoed in his mind. That was the point. That was what the team had tried. That was why they had failed. And now, it was his only hope. He glanced around, heart hammering. The crater's silence was oppressive, heavier than the forest, thicker somehow, as if the island were holding its breath. Every instinct screamed at him that he wasn't alone. He wasn't just being watched. He was being studied, measured, sized up. Then he heard it, the sharp snap of a branch behind him. He spun. At the edge of the tree line, the reflection waited. But it wasn't normal. Its face was wrong. Its eyes were too wide, too focused. Its mouth twisted slightly, shaping a smile that wasn't quite human, an expression that seemed to be learning how to mimic him. The air between them pulsed, tense and thick, charged with something alive. Evan swallowed hard, his hands shaking uncontrollably as he lunged for the console. The screen flickered violently, the wires sparking. The monolith pulsed faintly in response, almost as if it were alive, sensing his touch. His fingers flew over the panel, reconnecting wires haphazardly, trying to stabilize the prototype. Sweat ran down his face as his mind raced, heart hammering with a mix of fear and desperate hope. Behind him, the reflection moved closer, its steps silent but deliberate. And yet, Evan didn't dare look back for more than a split second. Every second wasted could give the island another moment to trap him forever. The hum from the console grew louder as he adjusted the wires, the monolith responding with a low, vibrating thrum. The air rippled, the trees bent slightly inward, and the symbols on the stone pulsed brighter, reacting to the activation of the prototype. This was it. This was the moment the previous researchers had failed to survive. And Evan knew he had no other choice but to complete it. Fast, precise, or risk being absorbed by the island's awareness forever. Evan's hands shook as he worked frantically on the console. The exposed wires sparked with unstable energy, hissing and snapping in tiny arcs that made him flinch. The humming from the monolith intensified, vibrating through the air and into his bones. It was low at first, barely perceptible, but steadily rising, like a heartbeat he could feel rather than hear. The symbols etched across the stone pulsed faster, almost impatiently, as if the monolith were aware he was trying to manipulate it. The reflection at the tree line watched him. Its face was still wrong, too wide-eyed, lips slightly parted, frozen in a mockery of his own expression. Every subtle movement it made was intentional, measured. It mirrored him sometimes, but at other times it moved independently, as though it were learning, studying, predicting. Evan couldn't afford to look at it for more than a second. Every moment he did, he felt the island trying to pull him in, trying to distract him, trying to claim him. His fingers fumbled over a loose connection. Sweat dripped into the console, shorting one of the circuits. Sparks flew higher, and the humming reached a deafening intensity inside his chest. Evan slammed the panel back into place, and for a heartbeat, everything went still. Then the monolith pulsed violently, sending a shockwave of air outward that made the surrounding trees sway. The reflection staggered backward as if struck, flickering like an image on a broken screen. Evan's chest heaved. Come on," he muttered, voice shaking. The prototype's instructions had been incomplete, fragmented. He had to improvise, or the island would never release him. He rerouted the power lines quickly, grounding them against the metal frame. Sparks shot again, and he ducked instinctively, biting his lip to suppress a scream. The hum became a low, vibrating roar. The monolith shivered, and the symbols glowed brighter, almost painfully. The reflection took a step forward, closer to the clearing. Its expression was learning, adapting, its mimicry becoming unnerving. It wasn't just a copy anymore. It was conscious, calculating, watching his every move. Evan ignored it, focusing entirely on the console. He reconnected a final wire, holding his breath as he pushed the activation plate with the heel of his palm. Instantly, a blinding pulse of light exploded outward from the monolith. Evan staggered backward, shielding his eyes. The vibration of the air changed. It wasn't threatening anymore. It was unsteady, chaotic, collapsing in on itself. The forest shuddered, the trees rippling and bending away from the clearing. Shadows stretched in unnatural directions, then froze. For the first time since he arrived, the island felt uncertain. The reflection stumbled and flickered violently, its body warping like a video skipping frames. Evan gasped for air, chest heaving. He hadn't anticipated the prototype would be this powerful. The hum slowed, then faded into silence. The monolith itself dimmed, the pulsating symbols returning to a faint glow, almost peaceful. The clearing felt lighter, breathable, like the island had momentarily let down its defenses. Evan's legs were trembling uncontrollably, his hands sticky with sweat and grime. He didn't dare look away from the monolith for more than a second. The reflection was gone, or at least it wasn't visible at the edge of the clearing anymore. That stillness felt fragile. Any distraction could allow the island to strike again. He knew he had to move. Now. Taking a deep breath, Evan sprinted from the clearing, his focus entirely on the shoreline and the hope that the prototype's pulse had created a small window of opportunity. Behind him, the forest had returned to its strange, oppressive stillness, but this time it didn't reach for him. For the first time, he felt the possibility of escape, of survival. And yet, he could feel the island watching. Patient. Waiting. Knowing. He didn't dare slow down. After what felt like hours, Evan finally broke free of the dense forest. The trees thinned abruptly, and he stumbled onto a shoreline that made his stomach twist. It wasn't the beach he had first awoken on. The sand was darker, almost metallic in hue, and the waves shimmered unnaturally, reflecting colors that shouldn't exist. The ocean itself seemed alive, pulsing faintly with a rhythm he could feel in his chest. But relief was fleeting. Something small and deliberate rested on the sand ahead, a compact emergency raft, solar-powered and intact. It looked abandoned, yet ready. Whoever had left it had survived longer than the rest of the research team, or had at least tried to. The sight sparked hope deep inside him, a tiny ember amid overwhelming fear. Evan sprinted towards the raft, ignoring the ache in his legs. The island around him was changing again. Trees along the edge of the shore seemed to lean closer, their shadows stretching unnaturally over the sand. A cold breeze swept across his skin, but it wasn't wind. It felt deliberate, like the island itself was testing him, nudging him toward the raft or away from it. The water was even stranger. Waves rippled as though obeying some hidden force, parting in unusual patterns that made him hesitate. Below the surface, he thought he saw movement, dark shapes sliding just out of reach, massive and indistinct. The ocean was warning him. The island was warning him. But he had no choice. Escape meant moving forward. He grabbed the edge of the raft and hauled it into the surf, muscles burning with exertion. His fingers slipped on the wet material, and a tremor ran up his arm as if the island wanted to pull him under. Ignoring the fear, he climbed inside and activated the motor. It sputtered, groaned, then roared to life, cutting through the water with a mechanical determination that matched his own. The shoreline behind him began to fold inward. Trees bent toward the water unnaturally, roots clawing at the sand as though trying to drag him back. Branches stretched like skeletal hands, reaching for him with long, deliberate movements. Evan paddled hard, pushing the raft into the waves as the island seemed to lunge at him. A distorted, echoing version of his voice called out from the tree line, impossibly familiar and wrong. "Come back." Evan didn't look back, not once. The island was patient, but he was faster. He fought against the unnatural tide, forcing the raft forward as the water shimmered in impossible colors, pulsing beneath him like a living thing. The waves twisted, collided, then parted again, as if giving him a narrow path to freedom. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Time felt wrong. The fog thickened ahead, stretching across the horizon like a curtain between him and the world. Finally, the island receded behind him, shrouded in mist. The ocean calmed. The waves returned to normal. The strange, metallic smell dissipated. Evan collapsed against the side of the raft, muscles trembling, lungs heaving, heart still hammering in his chest. He had escaped. The island was behind him, or at least it seemed to be. The air no longer pressed down like it had inside the forest. For the first time, he tasted something close to freedom. But he couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. Somewhere deep beneath the waves, or in the mist above, the island was watching, waiting, learning, patient. And somehow, he knew it wasn't done with him yet. The raft cut steadily through the water, leaving faint ripples in its wake. Evan's muscles ached, but he kept paddling, desperate to put distance between himself and the island. The fog ahead was thick, gray, and unyielding, but he had no choice. He had to keep moving, keep pushing forward, because behind him, the island was not done. The waves carried whispers, soft, overlapping, impossible to trace. At first, he thought it was the wind. Then he realized the voices were his own. Fragments of sentences he hadn't spoken yet, words he didn't recognize, carried in tones that were familiar and foreign at the same time. They echoed across the water, haunting him, threading through his thoughts. The compass in his hand spun wildly, ignoring true north. The sun flickered above, dimming and brightening like a dying bulb. Evan gritted his teeth, refusing to let himself be distracted. The ocean, the sky, the raft itself, all seemed to bend, as though the island's influence stretched further than he had thought. Every instinct screamed danger. Then, through the mist, a silhouette appeared on the horizon. It was indistinct at first, but gradually became a shape. A small fishing boat, empty, bobbing in the waves. Relief surged in Evan, brief and fragile. He paddled harder, adrenaline replacing exhaustion, willing the engine of the raft to hold. The whispers grew louder, now overlapping and distorted. They carried fragments of his own voice, taunting, urgent, warning him to turn back. The island had given him a window to escape, but it was not finished. It wanted him aware, awake, panicked, vulnerable. Evan ignored it, focusing on the boat, on the horizon, on anything that represented solid reality. Minutes stretched endlessly. The fog began to thin. The ocean returned to its natural rhythm, the colors stabilizing into familiar blues and grays. For the first time in hours, the world looked normal. The island had disappeared behind a wall of mist, vanishing completely from sight. Evan collapsed back against the raft, gasping for air, shaking uncontrollably. He was wet, cold, and exhausted, but alive. He had escaped. He had actually escaped. Every nerve in his body screamed in relief, every muscle ached, but he dared not celebrate. Survival had never felt so fragile. He stared across the calm sea, but the memory of the island lingered. The forest, the monolith, the reflections, they weren't just dangers. They were conscious, patient, and intelligent. He had survived not because the island had failed, but because it had allowed him to leave. It had decided to grant him freedom on its terms. Evan closed his eyes briefly, letting himself breathe, willing his body to stop trembling. But deep down, he knew the whispers would return. Somewhere the island was still alive, still learning, still waiting. The sense of being watched, of being hunted, would not fade completely. And yet, in that fleeting calm, he allowed himself a single thought. He had escaped. He had made it. And for now, that was enough. The fishing boat bobbed gently in the waves, distant but real. Evan hauled the raft alongside it, heart still hammering, muscles trembling. He clambered aboard, the wood creaking under his weight. For the first time in what felt like forever, he could breathe without the oppressive weight of the island pressing on him. He looked back once, toward the horizon where the mist had swallowed the island whole. The forest, the monolith, the unnatural waves, they were gone, hidden behind a veil of fog. And yet a chill ran down his spine. He couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, of something lurking just beyond sight, patient and patient still. The boat's motor was old but functional. Evan fumbled with the controls, finally coaxing it to life. The engine's sputter felt like a lifeline, a tether back to reality. As the vessel cut through the waves, he let himself exhale, small and trembling. He was moving. He was leaving. The ocean stretched endlessly, calm but unfamiliar. The colors muted now, normal in appearance, but not in sensation. He ran a hand over his face, still damp with sweat and salt, and tried to convince himself it was over. That the island had released him. That the whispers, the reflections, the oppressive awareness were gone. But then a ripple in the water caught his eye, a subtle, impossible shimmer, like the surface itself was bending. Evan's stomach clenched. The island's presence lingered, distant but attentive. It had let him go, but only temporarily, only partially. Its patience was infinite, its memory perfect. He gripped the edge of the boat, knuckles white, and let the engine carry him forward. With every turn of the propeller, the mist behind him thickened, swallowing the horizon. The island receded, but he knew it would not forget. He would carry its weight in his mind forever, the sense of being studied, of being hunted, the knowledge that it waited for him somewhere, always. Hours passed. The sun rose, breaking the gray horizon into muted tones of orange and pink. Evan leaned back, exhausted, staring at the endless water. He was free for now. And yet, a single thought persisted, gnawing at the edges of his relief. Somewhere, the island watched. Always. Evan closed his eyes, letting himself rest for the first time. The sea carried him forward, steady, away from the horrors he had survived. He didn't know what lay ahead, or if the island would ever strike again. But for now, the escape was real. The terror had loosened its grip. The waves lapped against the boat softly, almost soothing, but beneath that calm, a low vibration hummed faintly through the water. Evan shivered instinctively. Somewhere far behind the mist, the island waited, patient, aware, eternal. And though he had escaped its grasp, he knew in his bones that it had not released him completely. The horizon stretched ahead, endless and unknowable, but Evan moved forward. Every stroke of the motor, every breath of wind in his face was proof he had survived. For now. And in that fragile, fleeting peace, he realized one truth. He would never forget. He had escaped the island, but the island would always be a part of him,